Police in Los Angeles say witnesses in the death of rapper Notorious B.I.G. are afraid to talk.
Like I told people, I said if Miss Wallace would have called me and told me to shut it down, I would have shut it down.
The vault had been sealed since the late 90s. When the key finally turned, it wasn't a celebration, it was an investigation. News broke in March 2025. Voletta Wallace had passed at 78. For most fans, she was the shield around Biggie's name, the steady hand, the keeper of the truth. Days later, lawyers arrived with boxes, cameras, and a list of what to find. Unreleased tracks, contracts, maybe a few photos to warm the heart. What they walked into felt different. The storage was underground, cold and quiet. Metal shelves lined the walls, tape reels and lyric pads sat in neat rows. Nothing looked messy, nothing looked random. It felt staged, like someone knew people would come looking and wanted them to find only what was safe. At first, it was the usual. Studio reels, alternate takes, notebooks with scratched lines and arrows, the kind of things that prove a working mind. Then, the team found a cabinet bolted into the concrete. No label, no index card, just a heavy lock and a small tag that read, "Internal use only." That cabinet changed the room. The air felt heavier. The team filmed the seal, logged the time, and called in a second witness. When the lock snapped, the folders inside didn't hold music. They held maps, legal maps of who controlled what and how it moved, piece by piece, year by year. The dates were old, the signatures were familiar, the names were not. This was no family scrapbook. This was a road map. And if the road map was right, the real power over Biggie's legacy has shifted long before the headlines ever did. So why did no one say a word? A single memo at the bottom hinted the sale was only the finale. The setup began the year after Biggie died. The vault was never meant to be open like this, not with crime scene tape at the door and a legal team standing by. In March 2025, the world lost Voletta Wallace, Biggie's mother, his fiercest defender, the public face of his legacy. Days later, the estate she guarded for nearly 3 decades was no longer in family hands. The court order came down, and with it, a mandate. Unseal every file, every recording, every locked drawer tied to the Notorious B.I.G.
Investigators expected history, unreleased verses, dusty Polaroids, maybe a forgotten award or two. What they found looked more like evidence. The storage room sat 3 floors below street level, hidden under an office building with no signage. Fluorescent lights flickered above rows of shelves. Everything was cataloged in perfect order, but there was no warmth here, no sense of preservation. This wasn't an archive for fans. It was a vault for control. And then they saw it, the steel cabinet bolted to the floor, padlocked with industrial hardware. Its tag read only, "Internal use only." No one on the family side had ever mentioned it. When the lot gave way, the sound echoed like a warning. Inside weren't records of music, but records of ownership, contracts, transfer agreements, signatures spanning decades, charts of royalty flows and licensing rights, names no fan had ever heard before. Buried among them, a date jumped out, 1998. Less than a year after Biggie's murder, the paper trail suggested that control had started moving away from the family almost immediately. At the very bottom of the stack, a note hinted that the 2025 sale of Biggie's entire catalog wasn't a sudden decision. It was the final move in a plan set in motion 27 years earlier. For decades, the world believed simple truth. Biggie's legacy was safe because his mother was in charge. Voletta Wallace became the face of that story. In interviews, she spoke of dignity, respect, and protecting her son's name from those who might exploit it. She attended tribute concerts, approved documentaries, and reminded everyone that this wasn't just about money. It was about preserving Christopher Wallace, the man behind the music. Fans embraced it. Media reinforced it. The image of a mother guarding her son's crown became almost untouchable. And for a long time, it looked real. Royalty checks rolled in, anniversary releases kept his name alive, Biggie's image stayed clean, even as other hip-hop estates became mired in lawsuits and public feuds. But the files inside that locked cabinet told a different story. Behind the glossy tributes, there had been quiet moves, legal amendments, licensing shifts, and financial authorizations that slowly pulled the estate's core assets away from the family. On paper, Valletta remained the chair. In practice, decision-making power was drifting elsewhere. Two names appeared again and again in the documents, Wayne Barrow and Mark Pitts, industry veterans, close to Biggie in life, but the contracts suggested something far beyond advisory roles. Over time, their signatures appeared on deals that determined what music was released, where Biggie's name appeared, and how his image was sold. It was a subtle change, so subtle that fans and even some family members never noticed. Every shift was wrapped in legal language, hidden in clauses buried deep inside multi-page agreements. To the outside world, Biggie's legacy looked like a family's triumph over the cutthroat music industry. But here, in black and white, it looked more like the opening stages of a takeover. And if the paperwork was telling the truth, the real turning point wasn't Valletta's death, it was a deal signed more than 20 years earlier. The 1998 document wasn't flashy. No bold headlines, no signatures from celebrities, just a standard estate management agreement, the kind of thing most people would skim and forget. But buried in his clauses was the seed of something far larger. It named Wayne Barrow and Mark Pitts not just as advisors, but as managers with full operational control over critical parts of the estate. This wasn't a temporary role or a small slice of responsibility. It granted them authority to negotiate licensing deals, approve or reject music releases, and control the use of Biggie's name and likeness. The terms were open-ended. No expiration date, no automatic review by the family. From that point on, every contract tied to the Notorious B.I.G., whether it was a posthumous album, a documentary, or a merchandise line, ran through their desks. And with each passing year, the paper trail grew thicker. In the early 2000s, the estate approved branding partnerships that were profitable but uncharacteristic. Limited edition sneakers, clothing lines that had little connection to Biggie's image. Licensing arrangements for films where his story was trimmed to fit a marketing narrative. None of it caused public outrage, because few people knew who was making the calls. The face of the estate was still Valletta. She appeared in press photos, gave heartfelt speeches, and was thanked in award shows, but in the legal chain of command, she had been quietly moved out of the driver's seat. It was a shift so gradual, so carefully managed that by the time the control structure was fully cemented, there was no turning back. And when Valletta's health began to fail, the people in control didn't wait for her passing. They had already started negotiating the most controversial deal in the estate's history. March 2025 should have been a period of mourning. Instead, it became the moment everything changed. Just weeks after Valletta Wallace's passing, news broke that stunned the music world. The Notorious B.I.G's entire catalog had been sold. Not a partial deal, not a licensing partnership, everything. The buyer was Primary Wave, a powerful music investment firm with a reputation for acquiring legendary catalogs and squeezing every ounce of profit from them. They had already taken on the rights of Bob Marley, Prince, and Whitney Houston. Now, Biggie's life work was theirs. The scope of the deal was staggering. It included master recordings, publishing rights, unreleased tracks, branding control, and even legal authority over the use of his name and likeness. Essentially, if Biggie's voice or face appeared anywhere from that day forward, it would be because Primary Wave approved it. The timing is what set off alarm bells. Insiders whispered that negotiations had been underway for months, maybe years, while Valletta was in declining health. According to multiple sources familiar with the documents, the sale process was far along before the public even knew she was sick. Worse still, there was no public statement from Valletta, no interviews, no farewell message explaining why her son's life work was being handed to an investment firm. Silence. For fans, it felt like a betrayal. For decades, they believed the estate was sacred ground, a trust guarded by family. Now it looked like it had been traded like a stock, without their knowledge.
But the real shock came when investigators realized this wasn't just a business move. The sale was tied to something hidden deep in a locked vault beneath an unmarked building. The building didn't stand out. No plaque, no flashy signage. Just a narrow, nondescript structure on a side street most people never noticed. But beneath it, 3 floors down, was the heartbeat of Biggie Smalls' legacy, sealed in a vault that hadn't been touched in decades. It wasn't an archive in the romantic sense. There were no warm wood shelves or framed photos of Biggie on the wall. The air was dry and sterile. Rows of metal racks stretched into the shadows, stacked with identical gray boxes. The temperature was cool enough to make the breath visible. Every box was labeled, every reel numbered. Whoever kept this space ran it like a military operation. But as the investigative team moved deeper, one object broke the pattern. A steel cabinet bolted into the concrete, heavy, industrial, with a padlock far stronger than anything else in the room. A single tag dangled from the handle, internal use only. The lock didn't open easily. It took bolt cutters and 2 witnesses to break the seal. Cameras rolled as the doors creaked open. Inside was no music, no gold records. Instead, there were folders, thick manila envelopes, some stamped confidential, others marked only with initials and dates. The contents weren't arranged by song title or studio session. They were arranged like evidence in a case file. Legal contracts from the late 1990s through the early 2000s, flowcharts showing the movement of royalty payments, licensing agreements with vague catch-all language. And then there were the signatures, familiar names like Wayne Barrow and Mark Pitts appearing again and again in places fans never expected to see them. The documents painted a picture of control shifting, slowly but deliberately, from family hands to external managers. Each change looked harmless in isolation. Together, they formed a blueprint for how the estate could be run without the family's direct say. And at the very bottom of the cabinet, under years of dust, was a single sealed envelope marked "Retain, Private." Its contents would change the entire understanding of how Biggie's legacy was managed. The envelope was brittle with age, its edges curling and yellowed, sealed not with glue, but with 2 strips of legal tape. Across the front, in thick black ink, was written "Retain, Private." No date, no signature. The investigators logged it as evidence before slicing the tape. Inside were 3 sets of documents, each more unsettling than the last. The first was a series of estate restructuring agreements, legal rewrites of the original management framework established after Biggie's death. Dated between 1998 and 2002, they showed a gradual but deliberate transfer of financial and creative authority from the Wallace family to a network of companies controlled or influenced by Wayne Barrow and Mark Pitts. The agreements were heavy with legal jargon, fiduciary authority, exclusive licensing discretion, delegated operational oversight, the kind of language designed to sound routine while carrying enormous implications. The second set was a stack of licensing amendments. On the surface, they were about specific projects, a tribute album, a clothing collaboration, a documentary series. But in the fine print, each granted continuing usage rights far beyond the scope of the project, allowing the use of Biggie's image, voice, and name for unrelated ventures without new approvals. These clauses were blank checks, written decades before anyone knew how valuable those rights would become. And the third was the most chilling, a confidential memo dated only months after Biggie's death. It outlined a legacy management plan that made one point disturbingly clear. The public face of the estate would remain the family, but the decision-making power would shift quietly to experienced industry handlers for the sake of long-term profitability and market reach. In other words, the family would be the symbol, the outsiders would be the operators. And there was one detail that stopped the lead investigator mid-sentence. This memo had been co-signed by someone using the initials CWR, the same initials as Christopher Wallace. If it was genuine, it suggested Biggie himself had signed off on or been convinced to sign the first steps of the transfer. But handwriting analysis would later raise a dangerous question. Was that signature really his? Or was it the first forgery in a decades-long deception? If the CWR signature in the restricted files raised eyebrows, what came next set off alarms. The estate's legal archive contained a complete copy of Biggie's original will, filed in the months before his death in 1997. It was clear, detailed, and family-focused, naming specific beneficiaries, including his children, for everything from publishing rights to personal belongings. There were no vague clauses, no gray areas. But deep in the audit notes, investigators found repeated references to something else, a second document. Not a replacement will, but an amendment. In legal terms, a codicil. According to those notes, it had been drafted after the original and was meant to activate only after Valletta Wallace's death. If it existed, this amendment would have transferred full control of Biggie's intellectual property, catalog, and likeness directly to his children. That meant no outside managers, no investment firms, just the family. Except the codicil wasn't there. Not in the estate's physical files, not in court archives, not in any law firm's retention system. It had vanished. Instead, the probate file contained a later version of the will, one with subtle but significant changes. Key assets that were once explicitly assigned to family members were now described in vague terms or reassigned to designated representatives. Some of those representatives were corporate entities tied back to Barrow and Pitts.
When handwriting experts compared the signatures on the original and the altered version, their conclusion was cautious but damning. The second will's signature showed irregularities, changes in stroke pressure, letter formation, and pen flow. Not enough to prove outright forgery in court, but enough to raise the possibility that Biggie's wishes had been rewritten without him. And if that codicil truly existed, someone had a powerful reason to make sure it never saw the light of day. Money leaves a trail unless someone works very hard to erase it. For years, the public narrative painted Biggie's estate as a financial success story. From an initial value of around $10 million in 1997, reports suggested it had grown to over $160 million by the early 2020s. Tribute albums sold out, merchandising deals flourished. His name was as valuable, maybe more, than during his lifetime. But the forensic audit conducted after Valletta Wallace's death told a darker story. The growth was real on paper. In reality, vast portions of that wealth never made it to the estate's trust accounts or to Biggie's children. Auditors found an intricate web of shell companies and holding entities spread across multiple countries. Many were registered in known tax havens: the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Panama. These companies acted as middlemen between revenue sources and the estate's official accounts. A clothing line licensing Biggie's image, for example, would make a payment not directly to the estate, but to an offshore corporation with an ambiguous name. That corporation would then send only a fraction of the amount onward, keeping the rest in an account shielded by secrecy laws. The same pattern appeared with streaming royalties, film licensing, and even posthumous collaborations. In some cases, investigators could trace the funds no further than the first or second transfer before the trail went cold. The names behind these offshore companies were often obscured by nominee directors, Individuals paid to stand in as the public face while the real owners stayed hidden. But in several instances, the trail circled back to known associates of the estate's management team. Between 2010 and 2020 alone, tens of millions of dollars were siphoned away this way. And because the transactions were technically legal under the contracts in place, there was little recourse, unless fraud could be proven. To the public, the estate still looked strong. To the auditors, it looked hollow, like a house with a gleaming facade and empty rooms inside. And as bad as the missing money was, the audit revealed something even more devastating. Entire pieces of Biggie's creative history had been erased from existence. If the missing millions damaged the estate's finances, what came next wounded its soul. The Master Index, a meticulous ledger kept by archivists in the late 90s, listed more than 40 unreleased tracks. These weren't scraps or half-finished demos. They were fully produced songs, many recorded in the final years of Biggie's life. Some were rumored collaborations with artists who had since become legends in their own right. But when investigators cross-checked the index with the vault's contents, fewer than half remained. Entire reels were gone. Digital audio tapes that once contained master recordings had vanished. The most unsettling case involved a hard drive labeled Life After Death Diaries. This wasn't just music. It reportedly held personal audio logs, behind-the-scenes footage, and unreleased verses recorded in hotel rooms and private studios during Biggie's final tour. When technicians tried to access it, the screen returned a single message: no data found. Digital forensic specialists were brought in. Their verdict was chilling. The hard drive hadn't failed naturally. It had been wiped using military-grade erasure software designed to make recovery impossible. This wasn't an accident or clumsy deletion. It was deliberate. Why would anyone destroy such irreplaceable material? Theories range from protecting Biggie's private life to removing tracks that conflicted with the estate's posthumous branding strategy. But the truth remained locked behind layers of non-disclosure agreements and corporate silence. The result was the same: a gaping hole in hip-hop history. Songs fans had waited decades to hear were gone forever, and the story of Biggie's final months was now missing its most intimate chapters. And yet, even with music erased and money gone, the most explosive revelation was still to come: a single sheet of paper hidden in the darkest corner of the vault. It was easy to miss, just a thin folder wedged behind a rusted support beam in the far corner of the vault. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, edges frayed, the ink faded but still readable. At the top, in block letters, it read, "Do not trust." Below was a short list of names. Some were full names, others just nicknames or initials. But several matched the very individuals who decades later were in positions of authority over Biggie's estate. The same people who had signed off on the primary wave sale, negotiated licensing deals, and held control over unreleased music. The handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted letters, a heavy downward stroke on the T. Details confirmed by handwriting analysts who compared it to authenticated letters from Biggie's personal collection. This wasn't a memo written for lawyers or business partners. This was a personal note, a warning. There was no date, no explanation, just the list, and at the bottom a final line: "They'll take everything if you let them." For investigators, the implications were explosive. If genuine, the note suggested that Biggie anticipated betrayal, that he feared certain people would exploit his absence. And in the decades that followed, those very names had risen to the highest levels of control over his legacy. The paper was logged as evidence and sealed in a protective sleeve. No one from the estate's current management has publicly commented on its existence. To the fans, it's more than a document. It's the voice of an artist silenced once in life, and it seems silenced again after death. And now, the question hangs in the air. Was Biggie's legacy ever truly protected, or has it been sold off piece by piece while the world looked away?